Plants, everybody's got them. Now ours may not be the most beautiful ones in the world, but this plant stand isn't doing them any favors. And in fact, this one is just a repurposed piano bench that's just a little bit too short and not quite long enough. So let's get in the shop and throw something together that will finally give these puppies a good home. So first up is board selection, and in this case I'm going with two types of wood, both mahogany and cherry. And not only am I going with some rough cut dimensional lumber, but I'm also going with some leftover cherry strips that we used in our kitchen remodel. After a little bit of measuring and marking, I can then take my rough cut lumber over to my miter saw. And for these cuts, I'm cutting it to a little bit longer dimension than I need so that I have a little bit extra to work with. And with all those cuts made, I can now move over to the jointer and make sure that it's all squared up and begin to mill up my lumber. Now, one of the first questions you might be asking is, why am I using two different species of wood for this project? And I wish I could give you a better answer, but this was all that was available at the time when I started this project. Now, I've never had a hard time getting American cherry in the past, but right now at my local stores it just wasn't available. And since I had a ton of mahogany already in stock, I thought that these two woods would complement each other. Now, as you probably know, cherry tends to darken with more exposure to UV lighting. Therefore, the older it gets, the darker it gets, and once it gets to its darkest color, it really resembles mahogany. But we're going to do a couple of things with this cherry to expedite the process of it aging and becoming darker, which we'll get into later in this video, but right now I'm just finishing milling up this mahogany and cherry to its final thickness of 3/4 of an inch. With all of this wood now essentially S3S lumber, I can then take it over to the table saw to clean up the last edge. So with my table saw set to maximize the yield of this wood, I'll go ahead and rip off the last edge. And luckily with the dimensions of this plant stand, I'm able to get the full width of the top from just 2 boards. Now, I've never been extremely pleased with the final edge that's given from the table saw. So I'm going to match up the 2 edges that were cleaned up with the table saw and clean them up with the jointer. And with these 2 edges cleaned up, we can now begin to glue them up. And in this case, I'm using Gorilla Wood Glue that I picked up from Harbor Freight a few weeks ago, as I'm trying to incorporate as many tools and accessories that I've reviewed in the last couple of months. And I'll have to say the biggest difference that I noticed between Gorilla Glue and Titebond 2 is that the Gorilla Glue seems to be a little bit thinner. And it also seemed that the Gorilla Glue had a shorter open time, as it did seem that this glue cured up a little bit quicker. So after I had everything in clamps and did a little bit of glue cleanup, I can now move on to the next step, which is to begin to make the legs for this table. And in this case, I'm going to be using this 8/4 cherry. So I'll first need to mill this lumber up by cutting it a little bit long at 31 inches. And since this wood is so thick, you'll notice that I'm taking multiple passes to cut through this wood, as I'm really worried about kickback. And there was just a little bit of tension in this wood, so I'm glad I took my time. With this 8/4 lumber now cut down, I can now begin to cut out the blanks for these legs at just under 2 inches. And you can probably tell after making this aggressive cut that it's probably time for a new blade, as there was a lot of smoke put off from this cut. But I took it really slow and I was able to get all 4 legs off of 1/2 of this 8/4 piece of lumber. But even so, it did leave quite a few burn marks. And I thought one of the easiest ways to clean up these burn marks would be over at the jointer. And you can see after just one pass, all those burn marks are removed. So with one side cleaned up, I could rotate the board 90 degrees and clean up the perpendicular side. And with 2 sides perpendicular to each other, I could then clean up the last 2 sides over at the planer, giving me a perfectly square blank for my legs. And with the sides now cleaned up, I could square up one end of these legs and then cut it down to size. In this case, just a little bit over 30 inches. And just like that, I have 4 pieces cleaned up for each one of the 4 legs. And in the exact same fashion, I also cut out 4 rails for the side panels for this table. To give these legs a little bit of a lighter look, I'd like to cut a taper on 2 sides of each one of the legs. And I'd like this taper to come up about 3 inches from the bottom of the floor, so I'll set my multi-gauge to 3 inches exactly. Then I can make a marking on 2 faces of each one of the legs. And I'd like this taper to make the bottom of the leg have a width of 1 1/4 inches. So I'll mark off each leg at 1 1/4 inches from one side, and then I'll connect the 2 intersections with one line. And these diagonal lines will give me an idea of where I want the tapers to be. To make this cut, I'm going to use a tapering jig. By using the markings that we just made, I can align my wood on the jig so that we make the perfect cut. Once one cut's made, we can now take the blank out of the jig, rotate it 90 degrees to make the second cut. And just like that, we have a perfectly tapered leg on two sides. And with the jig already set for this taper, I can batch out the other 3 legs rather quickly. Now the tapering jig that I'm using for this process is made by Rockler, but there's a lot of other brands out there that are just as good. In fact, one of my favorites is one made by Fulton, and it's a fraction of the price of this Rockler. With all of the tapers made on each leg, we can now begin to lay out our panel. And layout is going to be key, as I want these 2 tapers to be on the inside of both edges of the panel. And since each side is going to be a panel, we need to cut out a dado for the panel to set in. And to make this dado, I'm going to be using a plywood router bit, which in my case, since I'm using 1/2 inch plywood, is set to be a little bit thinner than a 1/2 inch wide. So I'll make a test cut inside one of the rails to make sure that that 1/2 inch plywood will sit inside the groove. And pleased with the results, I can go ahead and cut out the dados into each one of those rails. For the legs, I'm going to have to do a stop dado, as I don't want to be able to see that dado beyond the rails. So to do this, I'm simply going to mark off where I want the dado to end on each one of the 4 legs. Then I can make a marking on my router table fence where the end of the leg will be so that I know when to stop that dado. And just to be safe, since we have tapers on this leg, I'm going to mark out which each side of the leg will have a dado. Then it's just a matter of creating the dado in each leg and then stopping the dado once the end of the leg gets to the marking on the router table fence. And it's really important to stop your router and let it come to a complete stop before lifting each leg off the router bit. And it would be really nice if they made these bits in a spiral upcut fashion, as this thing kicks off a lot of sawdust. With all the dados created, I can now take each of the 4 pieces of the panel and place them together. From this, I can now get a measurement for how big my panel needs to be to fit inside that groove. Then I can set my fence and cut 2 of the panels to width with the table saw. And for these panels, I'm just using some birch plywood that I picked up at one of the big box stores. With the panels cut to width, I'll now do a dry fit just to make sure that I have that width correct. To cut the panel to the correct height, I'm actually going to use my miter saw. And for each panel, I'll clean up one edge of the plywood and then use a stop block to cut it to height. And no, I haven't taken off my saw stop sticker that I placed on my miter saw for my April Fool's short. With the panel now cut to size, I'll do one last dry fit just to make sure everything fits. With both of the side panels now made, I want to begin to start thinking about the slats that we'll be putting on these panels. And it looks like I'll be able to put 4 of these slats on each one of the side panels with 1/2 inch spacing. So I'll just need to take a measurement so that I can cut them down to the appropriate size. But before I cut all these slats, I just want to cut one slat to make sure that I have all my measurements correct. And happy with the fit, I can begin to cut down each one of these 16 slats. And I can't remember how long these pieces of cherry were, but I was able to get 2 slats out of each piece. Now if you're wondering where to get slats like this, a good idea is to go into a hardware flooring store. You can get an entire box of these hardwood slats for a reasonable price. In fact, I paid about $150 for 150 of these slats. With all of these pieces cut to size, I created a couple of spacers at a 1/2 inch thick so that I could space each one of these slats equally apart. Then at the top and the bottom of this panel, I marked out where the slats begin and end for each one of the 4 slats on the side. And I had to do this on both sides of the panel, as I'll have slats both on the exterior and interior of each of the panels. It's these markings that will tell me where the slats will rest on the panel. Once all these markings are made, I can disassemble the sides so that we can work on the panel itself. So for the next step, we're going to use these markings to lay down some painter's tape. I'm simply laying down some painter's tape where the slats will lie on the panel. This will ensure that when we go to paint the panels, we'll have some bare wood when we go to attach those slats to the panels. By having the bare wood, this will ensure that the wood glue will hold the slat to the panel. Now you might be able to get away without doing this, but I just think this is a better way to do it. With both panels now taped up, we can now begin the painting process on these panels. And for this, I'm once again using some black paint that was left over from our remodel. This is the same paint that they used on a slat wall island that's in our kitchen. And it's this slat wall island that inspired this entire build, as this plant stand is also going in our kitchen. And it's really this black paint that will create a shadow line that will really make this piece stand out. And even though this paint was really nice, I put on 2 coats just to make sure that that wood didn't come through. With those panels painted, it was now time to get back to the slats. Now I'm not a big proponent of staining hardwoods, but since cherry has a very different color once it ages, I wanted to go ahead and stain this cherry. So I went to Home Depot and purchased this stain and poly to try to match the slats to the current kitchen. And unfortunately, this stain's going to bite me in the butt down the road, but we're going to go ahead and stain all of these slats on 3 sides. And the reason we're only staining 3 sides is that this stain has poly in it, and we want one side of the wood bare so that we can attach it to the side of that panel. Now, even though I said this is going to bite me in the butt down the road, I really like the color of this stain. It has a very natural look and really matches our cherry in our kitchen that's been aging for over 10 years. After everything's been stained, I can set it to the side on a couple of stickers so that we can move on to the next step. And this is where the stain kicked my butt. Now, although I really like the look of this stain on those slats, I didn't like the way it looked on these legs. You can see it's just a little bit blotchy and it really didn't have the look I was going for, and I think this is because that stain had poly in it. So regretfully, I had to sand all that stain off and start from scratch. And that's when I decided to go with this stain, which had no poly in it. This had a much more even color and had 0 blotches once it was applied. And I didn't have to leave this stain on for too long. After about 2 minutes, I wiped it off with a rag and it looked great. Now, I didn't have to restain the slats, but I did for the legs and rails, and once I was done, you can see I have a lot of stained material here. After letting all this dry for a bit, it was time to go back to those panels and remove that painter's tape. And you can see by removing this tape, it leaves me with just enough bare wood so that I can attach those slats with some wood glue, which we'll get to in just a moment. Let's go back to that tabletop. Now that that tabletop is cured up, it's time to get it out of clamps. Now, unfortunately, the wood for this tabletop wasn't perfect, as there was a couple of bug holes that I wanted to fill. And to fill all these holes, I just used some dark Starbond CA glue and just applied a little bit of accelerator. And while I let those bug holes cure up, it was time to move back to the side panels. Now, since we're using plywood, which is very stable, I'm going to apply wood glue to this panel. So it's not going to be a floating panel, since there won't be much wood movement. Instead, it's actually going to work more like a large spline. It's going to hold not only the rails, but the legs in place and make sure that they all stay together. And because of this, I don't think there's a need for tenons on each one of these rails. Instead, they'll just be butt joints with the rails connected to the legs. And that panel will have plenty of glue surface to hold everything together. And to make sure everything is aligned perfectly, I'm adding a lot of clamps to make sure all those joints are nice and tight. So while the sides cook, let's go ahead and work on the shelf as well as the rails that will go underneath the tabletop. So for this, I'm just ripping 4 pieces of cherry to the same width, 2 for the shelf as well as 2 for the rails. And the width for all these pieces is at the same width as that 8/4 that we used for the sides. And with all 4 pieces cut to size, we can put them to the side and move back to that tabletop. Now that that CA glue is cured, I want to cut this tabletop to length over at my MFT. So I'll take my track saw and clean up one edge so it's nice and square. Then I can take that square edge and get a measurement for my final length. Then it's just a matter of flipping the board over and cutting it down to the marking I just made. And just like that, we have our tabletop cut down to its final dimensions. With that now cut to size, it's now time to get back to our side panel by taking it out of clamps. The first thing that I want to do is to take both of our side panels and place it on the tabletop with it being upside down. Then I'll take my pocket rule and make sure that I have even spacing on both sides of the tabletop. With everything aligned, I can now take a measurement on the interior in between the 2 side panels. This will give me a length of what the rails and the shelf need to be. And to make sure that all 4 of these pieces are the exact same length, I'm just going to tape them together with some painter's tape. Then I can take this bundle over to the miter saw and clean up one end. With that end now cleaned up, I can take a measurement from this end and measure out to my final length. And with one swift cut, I can cut all 4 pieces at the same time, making sure that they're exactly the same length. And I'll just do a quick test fit to make sure that everything looks good. And with everything looking good, I can take them out of tape and begin to work on the shelf. For the shelf, I once again want to incorporate these cherry slats. To do this, I first want to figure out how thick these slats are, in this case 0.31 inches. With that measurement in mind, I now want to raise my table saw blade to 3/8 of an inch. And with my table saw fence set to a little over 1/4 of an inch, I want to create a slot into each one of these rails at 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. So I'll cut through 2 of these rails the entire length of each one of the rails. With the first pass made, I'll also take a piece of scrap and make the exact same cut. Then I can tap my fence over just a hair to make the second pass. Then I can make a cut on the scrap to make sure that I have a perfect fit with the slat. And once that's confirmed, I can go ahead and make the final pass on each one of the 2 rails. And it's these 2 rails that will hold the slats that will become the shelf. The other 2 pieces that we ripped earlier will not get this notch, as they'll go on the very bottom of the tabletop. So with my table once again upside down, it's now time to work on some joinery. And for this, I'm going to use my domino joiner, so I'll strike a line both on the rail as well as the end panel. These lines are going to allow me to line up my domino joiner so that I can create a mortise. And I'll do this on both sides of each of the rails. And if you don't have a domino joiner, this could just as easily be done with dowels. And frankly, you could even use pocket holes on this joint as well, as this joint will not be seen from the inside. And I'll have to say, using this bench vise was a huge help when putting in these mortises on the side panels. With the mortises made for the top rails, it's now time to make the mortises for the shelf. And this is done in the same fashion by creating a line so that you can align your domino joiner. Now another excellent tool that could be used for this process would be a dowel joiner. I did a whole video on this tool and it really is a great alternative for the domino joiner. And it frankly might even be a better tool to use for this purpose, as it gives you, I think, a little bit more glue surface for those dowels. Once all those mortises are made, it's now time to do a dry assembly by putting some dominoes into those mortises. To give this table a little bit more rigidity, I want to put a couple of cross braces right in between these 2 rails. And I did this exact same process for the bottom shelf as well. The first thing to do is to cut a couple of pieces down for those cross braces. And to connect these pieces, I'm just going to be using pocket holes using my Armor Tool pocket hole jig. Now if you're not familiar with this jig, you can check out this video here, as it automates the entire process of putting in your pocket holes. This jig completely automates your collar setup as well as your drill guide setup depending on what thickness of material you're using. And it even has a color-coded screw system so that you know exactly what size screw you should be using for each type of hole you're drilling, taking all the guesswork out of creating pocket holes with this system. Now this system was just purchased by Bora, so hopefully a similar system should be coming out from Bora in the coming months. But Taylor Tools has purchased the entire Armor Tool inventory and they're selling it for a deep discount. So if you're interested in getting this system at a steep discount, check out the links in the description below, and I even have a coupon code included. So now that we have the top rail support created, let's move on to the shelf. For the shelf, I want to use those same cherry slats and slide them into the dado we created earlier. But we'll need to cut them down to size, and we'll do this over at the miter saw. With 3 of these slats cut to size, I'll slide them into that dado to do a test fit. And happy with the fit, I'll cut the rest of these slats, and there's a total of 29 of them. And fortunately, I was able to get 3 of these out of each one of these longer pieces. And after a bunch of cutting, I had all 29 of these slats cut out. With that now completed, let's get back to the side panels. The first thing that I'll do is I'll remove both of the panels from the dry fit, and this will allow us to attach those stained slats to the side panels. And here's where you can see that bare wood comes into play. By applying glue to that bare wood, I can use a spacer and attach my first slat. And to hold that slat into place, I'm just going to use a pin nailer and attach my first pin in the center and then one on each side. Then I can place my second spacer, add some glue, and place my next slat. And I'll repeat this process going down the entire side of the panel. And this really is a quick process, and it really brings that side panel to life. And once that last slat is added, I can remove all the spacers and you can really get a good idea of what this thing is going to look like. And with one side done, I'll flip the panel over and repeat this process on the other side. And you'll notice I'm using the Milwaukee M12 pin nailer, and this is really a powerful tool. I have been really impressed with all the Milwaukee M12 tools I've taken a look at over the last few months. But I'll have to say this one is probably one of my favorites. For years, I've used Ryobi nailers and I've loved those, but this one is just so much more powerful and it comes in a nice little package. With the side panels now coming together, it's now time to get back to that shelf. And just like before, I'm going to have to stain each one of those slats that will go inside the shelf. And this went fairly quickly, and once it was all done, I was ready to install these slats. Now to install these slats, I'm just going to glue up one side of this table. So I'll start off by lathering up one side of the rail as well as one side of the shelf so that I can attach it to the side panel. And once I have enough glue on those mortise and tenons, I can tap the side panel in place. And you'll notice that the other side of this table is also attached, and this is just dry fitted. And the reason that this side is only dry fitted is so that I could slide those slats into the dado on the very end of the shelf. So now that one side is glued up and clamped into place, let's return to the tabletop. It's now time to clean up the CA glue, which is now fully cured. And it's at this time that I'll now complete the sanding on both sides of the tabletop. With everything now sanded, I now want to add a little chamfer on the very bottom of the tabletop. So with the chamfer bit in place, I'll go around the entire perimeter of the tabletop adding this chamfer. And this is just a small detail that I think adds a little bit more character. Now that the glue that we added to one side of the table has cured, we can now begin to add the slats to the shelf. So I'll add a few of these slats by placing them at a diagonal and sliding them into the dado. Now I want these slats to be perfectly placed, so I'm going to make a jig. So I'm going to take a piece of scrap wood and take a 1/2 inch spacer and attach it to the scrap wood using a piece of double-sided tape. Then I can remove the excess double-sided tape and my jig is complete. By placing this jig on top of each one of the slats, it gives me a perfect 1/2 inch spacing. Then I can take my pin nailer and tack each side in place. And this really made this whole process a heck of a lot easier. I was able to run down the entire shelf with 1/2 inch spacing really pretty quickly. And all of these slats are really providing a heck of a lot of rigidity to the table. I was also very pleased that my calculations were correct and each one of these slats covered up those cross braces. And even the final slat was perfectly spaced at a 1/2 inch away from the side panel, creating a really nice evenly spaced shelf. But I still needed to glue on that second side panel, so I removed it and added just a little bit of wood glue so that we could secure it into place. And with a couple of taps with a rubber mallet and some clamps, this thing slid right into place. Once that glue had cured, it was now time to add that tabletop. With the tabletop in place, you can really get an idea of what this plant stand will look like. To attach this tabletop, I'm going to add these little figure 8 connectors. These fasteners are really easy to add with a simple Forstner bit. I'm simply taking the figure 8 connector and finding the appropriate Forstner bit. Then I can take the connector and mark out where I want it to land. Then it's just a matter of boring out a small hole with the Forstner bit right where the figure 8 connector will go. You just want to make sure that that hole is deep enough so that the figure 8 connector is flush with the top. And I'll be adding a total of 6 of these, 2 on each side as well as 2 in the middle. And to give these connectors a little bit more movement, I just like to take my chisel and chop out a little bit on either side of the hole. And I'll do this for all 6 holes that I just drilled out. Then I can take my figure 8 connector, place it into the hole, and you can see how it can move back and forth with seasonal wood movement. Then I can take a drill and drill out a pilot hole right where the Forstner bit hit and attach the connector with the screw. And I like to hand tighten this as you don't want to over tighten it so that it can move. And with all that done, it's now time to get this mahogany top so that it matches that cherry. And since mahogany has such a rich color, there's no need to stain this. As soon as I apply the Rubio, you can see how that stained cherry completely matches this mahogany. And I'm doing the underside first. As you can see, there's a little bit of sapwood on this mahogany, as this will never be seen, and the other side has some beautiful mahogany color. And I'd love to hear from you if you've ever used Rubio, or if you have another hard wax oil that you prefer to use. I really do hate the price of Rubio, as I think it's way overpriced. However, I do like the fact that you can add just 1 or 2 coats and you're completely done. And it really does have such a natural look to it that I guess I'm willing to pay the price. And I do like the fact that if there's any future damage to it, you simply sand it down and reapply the finish. With all that finish applied to the top, let's attach this top to the base. To do this, I'm simply going to take a drill bit with a little bit of painter's tape and pre-drill a couple of holes for each one of those connectors. Then I can hand tighten a screw into the top on each one of those figure 8 connectors. The other nice thing about using these figure 8 connectors is they do have a little bit of wiggle room, so you can make some micro adjustments once you have attached a couple of those connectors. Well, that just about does it, and I think this thing looks great, so I had to enlist the help of my wife to get it up at the house. Well, it's taken me over a month to build with my aggressive tool review posting schedule, but I finally got it built. And I'm quite pleased with the results. From the mahogany top to the cherry bottom, I think both of these two woods complement each other nicely. And I couldn't be more pleased with the slat panel design. Not to mention incorporating these slats into the shelf, I think really adds some character. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on this long overdue plant stand build. And if you haven't already, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and share this video, as it truly does help out this woodworking channel. Also, if you haven't already, check out my website, FlynnDoggWoodwork.com. There you can find all sorts of fun woodworking accessories like all the t-shirts that I wear in my videos. And if you'd like to support the channel further, check out my channel memberships, where you get early access to all my videos as well as one member video a week. Until next time, take care as always.